Okay, hello everybody. We are here for the August book club meeting. I'm a little flustered because my cat just jumped up here and I had to throw him on the floor a couple times. I want to welcome you all again for another book club meeting. I'm just going to do a quick intro of all the people we have with us tonight. So, of course, we have Ben Sigurdsson, our books editor from the Winnipeg Free Press. We have our author, David Bergen. And we have Chris from McNally Robinson joining us once again. Same as usual, if you have any questions or comments, you can pop them in the chat box to the right of the video screen. And with that, I'm going to throw it over to Chris.
Thanks, Erin. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this lovely summer evening. When I get my hands on a new book by David Bergen, I always know I'm in for some great sentences. No matter what the story or who the characters, the basic rhythm of the individual sentences will carry its share of the pleasure of reading that book. I was thinking about the sentences as I read Hear the Dark, particularly for the second time this past week. I realized that as I entered each story, I was pleasantly lost. David doesn't set the scene, introduce the characters and their relationships, hook you into the plot and his openings, and then lead you along all the what happens next. I felt instead like I was watching an artist making a sketch, each line creating another mark on the page, and line after line, the image slowly but surely comes together. But David doesn't give us all of the lines. He withholds some of the details. He leaves some of the page white, some of the picture unclear. There are some things we don't get to know. I think that's the space that gives his characters the room to breathe and to feel so alive. They are searching for answers from beginning through the end, and so are we. What does end stand for? What will Bev do now? The questions are the point, and the searching is the living, and the room for possibilities is the meaning. And then you read the title again and think, it's not the white space, it's the dark. The exact opposite. And then I start thinking all over again about what it all means. So, David, would you please read us some of those great sentences?
Thanks, Chris. That was a very generous, lovely introduction. I'm actually, this is a collection and stories in a novella. And I'm going to read from the novella, which is called Hear the Dark. And it's near the beginning. The main character is Lily Isaac, and she belongs to, or she was raised in a fairly cloistered religious community called the Brethren Church. And I'll just read you what some of the definition of the church itself. And this is from early in the book. Her life in the Brethren Church was defined by the word no. No long hair on men, no voting, no education beyond grade 8, no short hair on women, no military involvement, no political involvement, no divorce, no insurance, no parties, no dances, no trade unions, no hanging out at gas stations, no tobacco, no alcohol, no Santa Claus, no Easter bunnies, no snowmobiles, no birth control, no politics, no adult sports, no chrome on cars, no four-part singing, no bright colors, no cosmetics, no jewelry, no newspapers, no radios, no television, no novels. The last no novels is I think the one that really hooks Lily. At the age of 17, when she visits her cousin Marcy, who lives in town, Marcy does not belong to the church, and Marcy introduces her to books. And they mostly novels, and she at first reads them at Marcy's place, and then she starts to take them home, which would be forbidden. And one of the books at one point that she takes home, Marcy says, read this, it's crazy and weird. And she said, there's a lot of sex in it. And then she smiled. And so Lily takes the book home and reads it through in one night. And the next morning, having not really slept, but knowing she has to get up, she leaves the book on the floor beside her bed. And the thing about this book is I think this happens to a lot of us when we read, the world of the book had been so foreign, so opposite, that she'd been absolutely repelled by it, and at the same time absolutely drawn to it. And so the book is left beside the bed, and then I'll pick it up from there. All that day she made jam with her mother. They picked strawberries and they hulled and washed the berries, and then Lily crushed the berries by hand and boiled them with sugar and pecked them and poured them into sealer jars and poured hot wax over the jam in order to seal the jars. And then they screwed on the lids and wiped the sticky jars with a hot soapy cloth and dried them and set the jars in rows on the kitchen counter. Late afternoon, she came in with fresh baskets of strawberries, and on the dining room table, she saw the book. It was lying face down on the oilcloth. Her heart went wild, and she paused, and then, uncertain of what would happen next, she entered the kitchen. Her mother was skimming the foam from a fresh batch of jam, spooning it into a white bowl. Lily carried on. Her mother said nothing. At supper, the book had disappeared, and still nothing was said. She washed the dishes after supper and then took her baby sister Karen out into the yard. Karen was 3, a miracle baby she was called, and everything that could be done for her was done with awe and love. It was still hot, and so Lily sat in the shade on an old wooden chair, and she watched Karen toddle circles around her fat brown ankles sticking out from her dress. Lily had sewn the dress for Karen earlier that summer from leftover cloth that Lily had used for one of her own dresses. The colors were a pale yellow and off-white, and there were pastel bouquets of flowers in the pattern. Lily's mind was scattered. She suspected that her father would open the book and study it. Her mother, she knew, would not touch it, and for this she was glad. Her mother was the harsher of the parents, more worried about the impressions of others, concerned about gossip and finger-pointing. Her father was more forgiving in a rueful manner, but she also knew that her father couldn't overlook this trespass. Dusk came. She gathered up Karen and carried her inside and boiled water for a bath. She poured hot water into the metal tub that sat on the kitchen floor. She added cold water and tested it with her wrist. Then she undressed Karen and sat her down in the tub. She scrubbed her back and soaped her little feet. Karen giggled and pulled away. She washed Karen's face and behind her ears. Karen fought. Lily persisted. Normally, she would have made a game of this, the washing, the bath, the scrubbing, but on this evening, she had no desire. When she had finished the bathing, she scooped Karen into a large blue towel and dried her, carried her up to her bedroom and set her down and let her run naked around the room. It was too hot for pajamas. She considered the nakedness of childhood, and she thought about the nakedness of adults, and she wished that she was once again a child. She tucked Karen into bed. They prayed together, and Karen kneeling on the bed, Lily kneeling beside the bed. When they were finished praying, she kissed Karen on the forehead and said goodnight. Her parents were sitting at the dining room table when she came down the stairs. Her Uncle Hans was there as well. The book was face up on the table. Lily paused in the doorway. Her father told her to sit with them. She did so. Her father pointed at the book and said, "What is this?" "It's not mine," she said. "Where did you get it?" She did not answer. Her mother sighed. Her father picked up the book and opened it and read. The passage he had chosen was sexual and frank. Lily wondered how he had found that passage. Had it just opened up to that page? When he finally halted, he placed the book on the table and he said, "How can this be edifying?" Lily shrugged. She had no answer, or no answer that would have satisfied them. "Have there been other books?" he asked. She shook her head. "Are you lying?" he asked. She shook her head. And then Uncle Hans spoke. His voice was softer than her father's, and he said her name, Lily. And then he said that ideas and images from the outside were forever dangerous, because those ideas worked from the outside to the inside and then back to the outside, so that what were our thoughts now became our actions. These are thoughts that seep into your soul, he said, and it is impossible to remove them. They are like ink stains. They sit inside you and cannot be scrubbed away. He said he would go outside and he would build a fire, and he wanted Lily to come out with the book, and together they would burn it. "It's not mine to burn," she said. "Well, whose then?" She didn't answer. Her father and her uncle rose and left the room, and this left her with her mother, whose face was hard. "Filth," her mother said. Was this true? Lily did not know. She wondered how it was possible to enjoy reading filth, for she had, and she hadn't. And then she realized that her mother was not referring to the book, but to her. She was filth. In time, Lily stood and picked up the book and walked outside. The sun was setting. The light was soft and the sky was gray-blue and the clouds were few. The fire was burning in a half barrel close to the barn. She approached her uncle, who stood alone and who gestured at the fire. Lily stepped forward and dropped the book into the flames. It did not burn immediately, for it was tightly bound, and even when it did begin to burn, the interior pages remained untouched. So her uncle took up an iron rod and prodded at the book and opened it so that the fire might attack all of it. During that time, no words were spoken. There was just the action of her uncle spearing at the pages and turning them and offering them to the fire. Then it was finished, and only ashes were left. Her uncle turned and walked back to the house. Lily remained. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she looked for a sign that might perhaps arrive in the physical world around her. And here the clouds, like many dark sheep gone astray, and here the orange sun burning the world, and here the hair that hides from the circling hawk, and here the stretched singing of waterlogged frogs, and here the light, and here the dark. Okay, there you go.
Such a great passage to start us off with, and ending with the title of the book as well. Obviously, these stories were well. Okay, before we get into that, I just wanted to sort of do a check-in with you. I mean, we spoke. This book came out in March, and you had a launch here. I believe it was on March 11th, which was essentially the day that everything just sort of came to a grinding halt. In many capacities, the NBA shut down, and like there was essentially most public events and stuff were sort of taken off the table. How have you been? how have things been for you for the last number of months? Does this change your daily routine a lot as a writer, or does it sort of is it sort of just something that exists out there, and you can sort of continue to operate in the normal way that you do?
I think probably my life is very similar to everybody else's life right now, with the isolation and the care and the baking of bread and doing home renovations and things like that. And it's the same also in the sense that I'm like every touring band that is no longer touring. I'm like the people who can't go to the office, and I've probably, it's easier for me in a sense because I'm older, and I think I feel for especially the young people who came out with books, who we're going to go on a tour to Europe with their band, or we're going to act in a play for the first time. So I certainly can't feel sorry for myself, and I've been very fortunate, but my life probably is not that much different than a lot of other people, and there's not much you can do about it. I mean, of course, it would have been lovely to go on tour, and that's one way of selling books, and selling books is a very important way to make a living, but I'm like millions of billions of other people. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and obviously, Chris, you can probably speak to the impact of what not having touring writers coming through places like McNally has been like, or whatever. But did you you had a bunch of dates lined up in behind this book, David?
Yeah. Going, I wouldn't call it a tour, but you're invited to book festivals, you're invited to readings, and mostly in Canada, and that's a chance to meet the reader face to face, and to read, to have the questions, and similar to this, except it's in person. And there is something about, because I mean, this book was written over 20 years, and there's a lot of time put into a book, and I wrote other books in between as well. But you spend a lot of solitary time working at writing, and you are alone, and then you have the opportunity to finally, step out a bit, and that didn't happen. And so and I think Chris could speak to this too, that the physical selling of a book is really important.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. I think your event was our last one.
Yeah.
Before we shut down, hopefully not the last one ever, but it as of now, it's
really brought the house down.
That's right. I was in Saskatoon that night, and I just wanted to get home.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a big difference to us. We don't feel it too much over the summer because there's not a lot of events over the summer, but we're going to start to feel it now. The difference, the celebration of it and the sharing of it. We think of reading as such a solitary activity, but I think all readers crave talking about what they're reading. I always think of it as coming out of a movie and you want to talk about what you just saw. And
Yeah.
come out of a book, I want to tell people, I want to talk to people about
Yeah.
what I read. And I think that's hard to replace. Some of these Zoom possibilities are there and they work somewhat, but yeah, there's nothing like getting together in a crowd and realizing that everybody in the room enjoyed the book and enjoyed different things about it. And
Yeah,
Yeah.
you just need to sort of close your eyes and imagine the atrium sort of at McNally, sort of full of people listening to you, sort of doing a Q&A with an author or listening to you read from your book.
that's where I should be sitting right now.
That's right. That's probably where we should all be sitting right now.
Yeah, I think the thing about these video conferences and the Zooms is that there's a sense that you have the possibility of being everywhere because you could be picked up where, but you feel sometimes like you're nowhere. You know, that you're in this space somewhere, and so it's the personal. I think is quite important.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess you were. This is your second book of short stories, and much different than your first one. In that your first one came out at the beginning of your career. This one is coming out, in this year, after having written many and published many successful novels and stuff. What is it like, sort of living with and promoting, or promoting as much as you can in this sort of day and age? A book with stories that do span such a larger period of time, like. Is it at first when is it different than sort of something that's fully formed that you've been working on sort of beginning to end and sort of taking out into the world now?
I didn't write these stories with the intention of creating a collection, and typically I don't write a lot of short stories, and that's probably why it took 20 years to put this together, and the novella takes up the half of the book. So the stories are not a lot there, not that many. But when I write a story, it has to come to me, and I would say that writing a collection of stories is more difficult than a novel in a sense that you have to have so many different ideas, and I say idea quite loosely because the impetus for a story, for a novel, when it comes, it's really you feel it's almost like you've been given a gift, and that doesn't happen very often. And so with a novel, you can expand that, and you can make the 200-300 pages, and there you have a novel, and you can focus on that one idea and those characters. Whereas with a story, if you do that 7 or 8 times, that's a lot of work, and you have to make it a lot more concise, and you have to. There's not a lot of space to move around inside a story and be lazy, and that's. I don't find them easy, but when they come quite easily. And the novella in here was actually was a novel. I had written a novel, and it had a different title. It had the same character, but I showed it to someone who said that wasn't working. So, and that's usually I don't show my work to anybody else before I just send it off. And in this case, the fact that I showed it to someone meant that something was off in it. And so then I looked at it again, and I chopped off the last 100 pages, and then it became the novella, and it was much tighter and it made more sense. The novel itself, which I never published, obviously, it became too literary, too self-referential, too postmodern in a way. So this is not postmodern.
Not so much.
I was going to ask you, David, about that, because the practicality of being in the middle of a project, say, and all of a sudden, as you describe it, a story comes to you, and then thinking of it as Erin's cat suddenly jumps up in the middle of her work, and she's got to push it back down to the floor. I mean, is that what stories do to you, or are you able to kind of push them into
yeah. That's a good question, Chris. If a cat story, if a story jumps up on my desk and asks to be written, I do not push it away.
No.
I write it, and sometimes they come between novels, and that's when the stories will come. if I'm casting about for something new to write. But for the most part, if a story arrives, I'll gobble it up and write it.
Let it go.
Yeah, and you referred to them when we talked in March. You referred to them with the same term as another interview that I found, which is a tingling, and which I thought to be a really interesting sort of way of describing it, where it's just like, something sort of in the back of your head. Maybe it's just sort of, giving you a signal that it's there and that you should go off and follow that path. And so that's essentially what you're doing then.
Yeah.
When you get that inspiration.
And it's not, I guess you could say following a path. I guess that's one way of looking at it. But there is that there's a sensation, and it's a bodily sensation that I have, and everybody else writes differently. But that for even for a novel, that'll sometimes happen. But for a short story that I will sit down and write, and I know works. And I should say that for this collection, I had about 16 stories that I could have chosen from, and I threw a lot of them out because I just thought, nah, that's not working. So I thought I would try to choose what was the strongest stories and put them in the collection. But when the feeling comes that I should write the story, it's I can see the story in my head. The whole thing is, that doesn't mean I know everything that's going to happen, and I don't know every character that's going to appear, but I have a sense of the beginning of the story, the middle of the story, and where the character is going to end up morally, not necessarily physically. But yeah, it's there. And so it's a lovely thing when you have that map in front of you, and it's there and you can just follow it.
Mm-hmm. Chris, do you have anything you want to jump in with here, or?
Well, I was going to change direction entirely. We're big fans of Biblioasis, the publisher of this book.
Yes.
And they're independent and small, and we're independent and small, so I think we feel some kind of affinity for them, maybe. But you've published with small publishers like Biblioasis and Turnstone. You've published with large ones. I was just wondering what your experience is with each of them, what the differences are.
They've all been really, really good. I think a small press can pay more attention. Because they have fewer writers that they're throwing out into the fall market or the spring market, and they're I think it's a bit more personal. I've been very fortunate with larger publishers at HarperCollins and McClellan and Stewart to have editors who were very. There was an intimacy there that it was great working with them. I should say that there's a difference between an editor and a publisher. The editor is the person you work with when you're writing the book and you're editing the book and you're talking about the structure of the book and you're trying to make it the best book possible. Whereas the publisher, which the editor is a part of, but separate from slightly, the publisher is more of a big machine that sort of takes over, and you have your publicist and you have your printer and you have they send it off, and they're publishing many books. So with Biblioasis, I was working with both the publisher and the editor, Dan Wells, and that's very interesting too, because he has his hands on everything, and he was great. And there's an intimacy there with both the publisher and the editor, which is the first time I've had that, except for Turnstone, of course, with my first book. But when I had my first book, I had no idea what was going on. I was just happy that someone wanted to publish my book. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I will actually bring it back to sort of where we had sort of been before that question, which is a great question, and I really appreciated hearing about that as well. Where was it? Right, in the first story, April and Snow Lake, in the first story in the book. I don't know if it came chronologically. The protagonist is talking about being an aspiring writer of novels or short stories, and says, quote, "There was room for grace and sin in the world of novels." And I definitely feel like that is the theme that sort of runs through a lot of these stories in Hear the Dark. Was that, and you've talked about sort of there being a theme that runs through a lot of these books when we spoke before, or a lot of these stories when we spoke before. Can you just sort of talk about the theme or themes that do run through the stories in this collection?
Well, I can. It's difficult for me because I'm quite close to my stories and the novella, and for me to talk objectively about that, but I can talk about it in sort of a glancing aside at the reviews that have come out about the book. And there was one recently where the reviewer talked about faith, the theme of faith running through, and not necessarily, good faith, but bad faith as well, and the struggle with faith and doubt. And yeah, certainly that is present in many of the stories. I would have to say probably I was working out some of my own stuff, but I was also curious. I'm interested in how people make choices. I'm interested in how they decide on their morality, and a great way to do that is to create characters who are confronted with having to make choices, and often they might not be religious choices, but they might be moral choices, and that's where, sometimes religion comes into that, sometimes faith comes into that. In the case of Lily Isaac, the main character of the novella, it's definitely a struggle between what faith means, what community means, what ideas are, what do words mean, why can't I read books, what's going to happen to me if I ask questions, if I have doubt, all those things. And those are the things that a lot of the characters are probably asking. Not all of the stories. There's one story called How Can N Man Share a Bottle of Vodka, about a math teacher in a high school. And it has very little to do with faith or religion. It has more to do with an interior struggle, which you could say also has to do with faith and doubt as well in yourself. So it's faith. When people say these are books about faith, I wouldn't even necessarily be able to define for you what faith means, but it's a term that's fairly easy to put out there and use for convenience.
Sure, and I'm sure over the course of your writing career and your life that your ideas about faith have changed so much too. So a collection like this that sort of does span so many years, you can't really encapsulate one feeling of it so much, and sort of almost like a check-in, throughout your life in terms of how you think about those things.
Yeah, and April in Snow Lake in particular is about a young man who goes up to work on a construction crew in Snow Lake, and he meets a young woman named April, and I think that in particular was an exploration of a sort of a misapprehension of the other or the stranger or someone you don't know very well, or you think you know, then you find out that you didn't know. And so that had to do with assumptions, and it had to do with ego and a sort of a brazen sort of overconfidence that was measured out, and he was taken down a little bit. So there too, it was, and of course I explore novels and short stories I use myself, but they aren't autobiographical, but I definitely use myself in the stories. Yeah.
Chris.
I read the how many
N Man Share a Bottle of Vodka.
That's the one. I read that as another exploration for answers. Science and math, they tell us that they offer all kinds of answers, and they do.
Yeah.
But they offer ultimate answers.
That's true. Good. See, these are the things, Chris, that I can't necessarily give you about my books or my stories. I think the reader is sometimes a bit more astute as to what's going on in the stories than I am. Yeah.
Right. That's interesting.
I mean, in another review, there was a reference to so much water, which sounds like a Raymond Carver story. So much water so close to home, but the water references in the review, he and I thought, really, there's a lot of water, is there? And so that was interesting. Yeah.
It's interesting to think about sort of writers like Raymond Carver or other writers Alice Munro who just sort of focus on the short story, and would be interesting to sort of hear their processes versus a novelist who occasionally does compile short stories and stuff. But that is for another
Yeah.
time and another place. And
I think Raymond Carver did try to write a novel at one point and did not manage.
That's right. That is true. So I've got a couple sort of questions from readers. Again, maybe I'll actually combine one from a reader and one sort of that I came up with. So Shirley Canty asked whether you found a collection of short stories easier or more difficult to write than a complete book. And I will add my part to this question, which is do you think short fiction is a better place for a burgeoning writer to start? Or are there as many or fewer pitfalls as there might be in a novel, putting together a novel? Just a couple small questions.
No, that's good. I think, well, when I wrote my first collection of stories, I didn't have the faith that I could write a novel. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe I can write a short story. And then I wrote a short story, and it was accepted for publication, which I found to be absolutely astounding. I thought, well, what did I do in that story that made them like it? And so I went back, looked at that story, and I tried the same thing out again. And of course, you read a lot when you write, and you try to find a model or a template for how to write a story. So then I didn't think I could write a novel, and so I wrote stories, and I published a collection. And then even though I had published a collection, I thought, okay, well, now it's time to write a novel, because of course you have to be with the big people, right? And novels being that sort of that apex. But I still didn't know how to write a novel. I'd read a lot of novels, but didn't understand structure. So then my next book was called A Year of Lesser, and it was a novel, supposedly, but it started off, I wrote a short story, which was accepted and published. And then I wrote another short story, which was the same character, but a little bit further down the line in the same year of that character's life. And it was published. And then I thought, oh, maybe I have a novel here. And then I expanded it a little bit, and I added other characters and and it ended up with 12 chapters, which represented 12 months of the year. And I called it A Year of Lesser. And we called it a novel. Some reviewers called it a series, a connected stories of a novel in connected stories, which is fine with me. I have no problem with that. But I think the tough part about a novel, and this is where it becomes, because a short story, you can write 3 paragraphs, give it a title, and if it's good, you can call it a short story. Well, you can't do that with a novel. And a novel requires structure, and it requires a framework that is one of the toughest things to figure out when you're writing a novel. Like, what is the structure? What is the foundation of this story? And how do I map it out and move characters around the rooms of this house, which has a foundation? And that's probably one of the biggest pitfalls of a novel for new writers, is that it becomes too baggy and they don't know where it's going to end, and therefore it never ends. Yeah.
Is there sort of a regular process you go to, like, when you're trying to figure those things out? Can you just sort of, having written so many novels, sort of go into this mode where it's like, okay, I need to move this character here, I need this to happen, I need, or is it different for every one of your novels?
I'm pretty traditional in my writing, and also I'd say probably fairly traditional in my storytelling. I'm not terribly experimental, and so, but that's because I like to read a story that although I read some great experimental novels that are wonderful, I just don't think I can do them. And so I usually start with, I don't think my novels are plot driven. They're more character driven. So a character bangs up against something, and what happens when this character bangs up against something, and what are the choices, and what happens next, and what are the consequences of the choices. And then it sort of follows from there, and other characters arrive, and they bang up against this character that exists. And there's a movement of, I would say, a little bit of suspense as to what's going to happen to the character. And even as I'm writing it, I myself am curious about the suspense of what's going to happen to this character. So if plot is a form of, or produces suspense, I think character also can produce suspense, and it's also way more interesting. Although I have read my Robert Ludlum books.
Well, and I think focusing on character rather than plot can also be conducive to, I would think, to writing short fiction as well, because with short stories, you're not drawing this big long overarching plot. You're really just sort of focusing on character, and you're looking at sort of a snapshot of a character or characters and and what they're doing versus this longer more flowing piece.
Yeah, although I'm really interested in writers who, and I'm not particularly good at this, but I read a short story recently which worked really well, and it covered the lifespan of a female character, starting from when she was in her teens all the way till when she was in her 70s, or maybe 60s, let's say that, and how the movement and the way the story was blocked out made perfect sense. There were tremendous leaps in years, let's say 20 years passed, and it was just a white space that showed you that those 20 years had passed. And all of a sudden you're 20 years later down into the character's life. And it worked really well. And I think it's kind of a fun way to write, because you can cover a person's life in 30 pages.
No big deal.
No.
Excuse me. And so when we spoke, I guess back in March, you had mentioned that you had sort of been tinkering with, or not tinkering with, but those weren't the words you used, but you'd been working on a novel again that, you said it might be historical, it might not be. Have you found you've been able to make pretty good progress on that, or have you just jumped into a different project altogether, or what have you?
Well, now I have to confess, I'd have to say that the time of the coronavirus has rendered me fairly useless in my writing, although I've been editing a different novel. But I'm not particularly. I need to just sit down and write. Now I've been doing the editing of my other novel. I've been doing some of this stuff for this novel, for this story, the story collection. But it's been hard to write. I have to say it's been hard to write during this time. Things have been, in all of our lives, turned upside down, and there's a lot of political turmoil, which I probably read too much news, get embroiled in that. I have been reading a lot, which is a good thing, and that I find useful. But I can still, but the story I was telling you about, which might or might not be historical, is still there. I can still feel it in the back of my head, so I know I'm going to get to it. And I thought, I'm replacing my knob and tube in my house right now. Once I've done that, I'll start.
Hey,
I'll go back to historical fiction.
No judging, no begrudging. I'm in the middle of getting a house ready to list and moving things into storage spaces and pods, and so nothing is normal right now. I'm also getting ready for my kids to go back to school next week.
That's tough. Yeah, really tough. Yeah.
Who knows what's going to happen with that? Well, what are a few of the things that you've been reading during this pandemic?
I've been reading. I just finished. I'm not going to get the name right, but Chris will know.
Okay.
A Chinese writer. He won the Nobel Prize, and he wrote Soul Mountain and One Man's Bible. But I don't know how to pronounce his name properly, so Xin Qian. Xin Qian is his last name. Okay, and we were at the lake recently tenting, and I read One Man's Bible, and it was a wonderful book, and I love reading Chinese writers. I don't know if Ha Jin is a Chinese. Is he Chinese writer? Waiting, yeah, I think he is too. And I like.
He writes in English.
He does write in English, and Xian Chen writes in Chinese, in Mandarin, I believe. But I think what I liked about it was a writer struggling against the sort of the confines of the political system that he's working within, and he of course grew up he writes about growing up during the time of the Great Leap Forward and Chairman Mao, and how you had to turn other people in before you were turned in, and which human nature being what it is, I thought he caught it very well, and a great story.
Have you read Ma Jian?
What's that?
Ma Jian, he wrote Beijing Coma.
No, I've not read that.
Oh,
Okay.
got to read Ma Jian.
Is it written in English as well? It's translated, obviously.
Translated, yeah.
Okay. Send me a note, Chris.
Or stop into McNally Robinson Booksellers and see Chris and shake him down for that.
Well, Chris is a great reader, and we don't talk to each other much, but whenever we do meet in the store, he's always got wonderful suggestions. Yeah.
I tell people I read for a living.
Yeah.
I tell people that too, but they don't believe me.
Yeah.
Mainly because it's
Also, I just picked up Native Son by Richard Wright, and I'm halfway through that, and oh boy, it's a good book to read in this time in particular with the protest and the Black Lives Matter. It's very worthwhile. Yeah.
Well, I see Aaron is back, so I think that's time for us to sort of get things wrapped up, and I will hand it over. I will throw it over to Aaron. Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you so much, David. It was just a pleasure to talk to you both.
Yeah, great. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you all.
And, talk to you soon, hopefully.
Okay.
I have returned with my fake books above David's real books. It makes me a little embarrassed, but we're going to keep going. Thank you all so much for that conversation. I am a huge fan of short fiction, so I really enjoyed this collection. And it was just like an interesting diversion from our normal book club pick. So I'm really glad that we did that. I'm popping back on to let you know about our September book club pick, which is a kind of a new thing. We're trying a collaboration with the Institute for International Women's Rights, Manitoba. They had reached out to us because they were doing an event with author Tanya Talaga, which unfortunately had to be canceled because of COVID, of course. So they've rescheduled their virtual event for October 1st and asked if we would be willing to host a partner book club event. So we're going to be doing for September All Our Relations by Tanya Talaga. And we're going to be doing our book club meeting on a Wednesday, September 30th, to coordinate with the IIWR. It's going to work the same as book club always does. We're still going to send questions, and it's not going to be any different for you other than we're going to have a representative from the IRWRMB at our next meeting, and columnist Negan Sinclair, who's a friend of author Tanya Talagas. He's going to be hosting, doing the free press duties on that one. I think that's almost everything that I needed to tell you. There's an email going out tomorrow morning with more information about the book, as always. And I've received a couple emails from people asking how long that we're going to continue to do the book club. We're just going to keep going. Ben and I have chatted. We've picked books until the end of the year. And as long as you guys are still interested in participating, we're just going to keep going. So thanks everyone for your emails and for your questions. Thanks to Chris and Ben and David again. And we will see you next month.
Bye-bye.
Bye.